Sadly, since this episode was recorded, one of its subjects and indeed contributors, Michael Allaby, has died. He passed away at the beginning of May 2025 at the age of 91. Michael was always an enthusiastic and generous contributor and was more than happy to give his time to update his goings-on for the profile of him that is contained herein. I'm very grateful to Michael and would like to dedicate this episode to his memory. Hello there, I'm Toby Haydock, and the machine will enslave them now. Welcome to Too Much Information, which aims to tell you the who, what and when of Doctor Who, a television programme which demonstrates that travel may broaden the mind, but home is where the TARDIS is. Whether you're discovering the episodes for the very first time or you know your William Hartnells from your Stephen Dartnells, then you're extremely welcome on this odyssey behind the scenes, which aims to go through the series one episode at a time. In this edition, our intrepid foursome, now joined by Sabitha and Altos, complete their quest across the planet Marinus, and in true Terry Nation style, it all ends with a very big explosion. So join me, Toby Haydock, as I give you the who, what and when of Doctor Who, the Keys of Marinus, or there and there and there and there and back again. First broadcast on the 16th of May, 1964. At 5:18 p.m. It starred William Hartnell as Doctor Who, William Russell as Ian Chesterton, Jacqueline Hill as Barbara Wright, and Carol Ann Ford as Susan Foreman, with guest stars Donald Pickering as Ison, Henley Thomas as Taran, Robin Phillips as Altos, and Catherine Schofield as Sabitha. It was written by Terry Nation, produced by Verity Lambert, and directed by John Gorrie. It was watched by 6.9 million people, and the audience appreciation was 63. Ian has been sentenced to death by the authorities of Millennius. With time running short, his life depends on his friend's ability to unmask the conspirators who are really trying to steal the micro-key. When Susan is kidnapped, Barbara concludes that the only person who might be able to help them is Carla, the widow of the corrupt guard Aidan. But while Barbara believes that Carla will be motivated by a desire to unmask the people responsible for her husband's death, little does she realise that Carla is actually part of the conspiracy. Unless she can see through the other woman's lies, there will be no way to save Ian and Susan and recover the micro-key. And even if she does, lying in wait on the island which houses the conscience machine is Yartek, the leader of the evil Voords. The When. 3rd of February 1964. As we've discussed before, this is the date of the main script conference for The Keys of Marinus, with Terry Nation hosting Doctor Who story editor David Whittaker at his London flat. Episode 6 appears to be the only instalment that does not feature in the ensuing discussion. Instead, with the first 4 parts more or less hammered out by the two men and some basic ideas established for Episode 5, Nation develops the concluding script entirely on his own. And incidentally, because Episode 6 will also wind up being called The Keys of Marinus, we'll generally just be calling it Episode 6 for the purposes of this podcast. If we mention The Keys of Marinus, we're talking about the entire 6-part adventure. 25th of February 1964. Episode 6 has now been submitted to the production office. At this stage, however, Altos has not yet been added to the storyline because he's still intended to appear only in Episode 2, The Velvet Web. That change won't happen until mid-March, by which time it's been decided that the character will be retained throughout the remaining 4 instalments. Altos's presence will help address the absence of the Doctor from Episodes 3 and 4, The Screaming Jungle and The Snows of Terror, which has resulted from the decision to release William Hartnell for a fortnight's holiday. 5th of March, 1964. Filming for The Keys of Marinus takes place at the Ealing Television Film Studios. Whilst most of the work is for the opening instalment, The Sea of Death, some of that material, shots of the island and the pyramid housing the conscience of Marinus, will also be repurposed for Episode 6. 5th of April 1964. Terry Nation's script for Episode 6 includes a scene set in the courtroom which was introduced in Episode 5, Sentence of Death. As such, on this date, a wardrobe form is submitted for the 20 extras who will play courtroom observers in both Episodes 5 and 6. Over the next 48 hours, however, rewrites either eliminate or relocate this material. As a result, on the 7th of April, revised instructions issued to book the extras only for their scenes in Sentence of Death. 9th of April 1964. Nearly 3 weeks have now elapsed since The Sea of Death was recorded, and it's been discovered that the Conscience Machine prop has suffered damage in the interim. Terence Cook, the organiser for BBC Drama's Serials Department, writes a memo of complaint to James Moody, the head of scenic servicing. This isn't the only design-related headache for Episode 6. Earlier episodes of Too Much Information have chronicled how the production office has been getting incrementally later in providing Raymond Cusick with the information he needs to start working on his design drawings. This is the day that Cusick finally gets these details for Episode 6, but they should have been delivered 6 business days ago. In fact, Cusick is meant to submit his completed drawings tomorrow, 10th of April, but he isn't able to do so until 14th of April 1964. While the production office is taking receipt of Ray Cusick's design drawings, Terence Cook gets a response from James Moody regarding his 9th of April memo. Moody concedes that scenic servicing staff were responsible for the damage to the Conscience Machine, and he offers up to £100 from his own budget to effect repairs. However, Moody also takes the opportunity to complain that his employees are being given responsibility for too many sets and props. 16th of April 1964. John Gorris' secretary, Anne Earle, writes to Pauline Mansfield-Clark of Artists' Bookings about Peter Stenson. He has been hired to play a Vord in Episode 6, having also been one of the aliens in The Sea of Death, as well as an ice soldier in The Snows of Terror and the second judge in Sentence of Death.
It now appears that Peter Stenson has rather a lot to say and do in Episode 6.
Earle explains.
At the moment, he's on a glorified walk-on contract. Could you please arrange to pay him the same amount as he got for Episode 5?
He would always have been credited, even if the role was, as described, a glorified walk-on, and this memo covers his fee only. 20th of April 1964. Episode 6 rehearsals begin at the Territorial Army Drill Hall on Uxbridge Road. In addition to Stenson, Martin Court is also back beneath the rubber as a Vord, following his turns as a warrior statue in The Screaming Jungle, and then the more substantial role of Aidan in Sentence of Death. But whereas Gordon Wales had completed the Vord triumvirate in The Sea of Death, Episode 6's third Vord, unnamed in early drafts but ultimately identified as Yartek, is played by Stephen Dartnell, whom director John Gorry remembered from his roles at the Royal Court in 1956 and 1957, when he appeared in plays like The Crucible and The Country Wife. Meanwhile, another familiar face in Episode 6 is Alan James. Like Stenson, he was an ice soldier in The Snows of Terror and a judge in Sentence of Death. In Episode 6, he's knocked off his judicial perch to portray a Millennius Guard, perhaps the first judge's slightly less ambitious, and indeed hirsute, twin brother. 24th of April 1964. The Keys of Marinus, Episode 6, is recorded at Lime Grove Studio D. 16th of May 1964. Although Episode 6 is scheduled for Doctor Who's regular 5:15 p.m. start time, it winds up running 3 minutes behind schedule and finally gets underway at 5:18 p.m. The audience decline, which had begun last week, continues as a drop of 1 million viewers takes the broadcast down to 6.9 million. That's 3.5 million less than had watched The Snows of Terror a fortnight earlier. Doctor Who sinks 14 places to 43rd in the weekly chart. That's its lowest position since the penultimate instalment of Marco Polo nearly 2 months ago. On the bright side, the appreciation figure of 63%, 2 points better than Sentence of Death, is the highest achieved during the Keys of Marinus and the best Doctor Who has managed since the opening episode of Marco Polo back in February. The What. As with the earlier episodes of The Keys of Marinus, Episode 6 begins with a reenactment of its predecessor's closing moments. When we move into the new material, Jacqueline Hill stumbles over her speech about the Doctor. Her second sentence is meant to be,
He must keep his mind absolutely clear in order to concentrate on Ian.
but instead she accidentally gives the opposite sense by repeating the mustn't from her previous sentence. A rather odd stage direction accompanies the brief scene of Ian in his cell. Having already described the way that the clock is divided into quarters, Terry Nation then writes that the pointer is in a position like 20 to the hour, and the star is where our 20 would be. Presumably his second reference to 20 is actually supposed to read 12, which is certainly how it's portrayed on screen. In the Too Much Information for Sentence of Death, we discussed how the set dressing for the courtroom set was intended to evoke the totalitarian nature of Millennius. The same undertones are meant to be found in the guard's clothing, as a wardrobe listing prepared on 9th of March makes explicit. Here, the outfit worn by Alan James is described as a modified Nazi uniform. When we switch back to Barbara, Sabitha and Altos, Altos suggests that Carla might know something that Aidan was seeing quite frequently. In the script, however, the line is quite recently, which still makes a kind of sense, although it's a bit of a struggle. It seems fair to assume that Robin Phillips was correcting a perceived typo, and that's definitely what he does a few seconds later. His statement that Carla would be as eager as we are to find Aidan's killer is misprinted as evil as we are in the script, which would give a whole other meaning and an incorrect one altogether. The sudden jump from the courthouse anteroom to Carla's apartment probably results from an edit of the recorded material. As scripted, the new scene should start as Carla paces back and forth, very worried and nervous. She stops at the telephone, her hand poised over it. She fights back the impulse to use it. As if to calm herself, she moves to a small table with a mirror and starts to fix her tear-stained face. There is a buzz from the door. Carla looks towards it inquiringly. It sounds again. She crosses slowly toward it and opens it. While Episode 6 isn't the longest instalment of The Keys of Marinus, that honour goes to The Velvet Web at 25 minutes and 37 seconds. It still has a total duration of 25 minutes and 11 seconds, so it's not hard to imagine that the unbroadcast action would have bloated Episode 6's runtime beyond what was permissible, and so a snip was made. The rest of Altos's speech to Carla after divulging the threat against Susan's life was written for Barbara. Again, Robin Phillips replaces seeing quite recently with seeing quite frequently. After Carla starts to weep, Barbara's speech seems to incorporate another scripted error.
You're our only help.
She says to Carla, but surely this is meant to be,
You're our only hope.
or has 40-plus years of watching the original Star Wars just imprinted that line onto our brains? When Carla drops her grieving widow act, Terry Nation writes that she adopts the most evil grin, her laugh a frightening, spine-chilling sound. The staging of the shot where Carla prepares to execute Susan doesn't quite match the scripted intent. There, we see the terrified Susan behind Carla as she retrieves the gun from its drawer. A stage direction at the start of the next scene tells us that Doctor Who sits in the depths of despair. Soon afterwards, when Ison bids farewell, the televised episode cuts to Larn storing the mace and other evidence in a cabinet, which he then locks. In the script, however, this shot is just part of a more extensive set of stage directions, in which Taran closes his file of papers with a sigh, and then looks sympathetically and moves towards Doctor Who. Also not quite conveyed on screen is the interrogator's scripted reaction to the Doctor's dismissal of his suggestion that it is time to leave the anteroom. Taran looks at him with pity. At the start of the next scene, the script indicates that Doctor Who stands with his arms around Susan's shoulder, but Barbara takes his place in the broadcast version. In the brief shot that follows of Ian in his cell, the camera script requests a cut from the close-up of William Russell on camera 3 to a close-up of the clock on camera 2. The latter shot doesn't appear on screen, and may have been deemed unnecessary because the clock is perfectly visible on the wall behind Ian. The action at the start of the scene where Ison is unmasked differs in its details from the stage directions. On screen, the masked figure almost immediately bursts through the doors into the room. However, Terry Nation imagined that there would first be an establishing shot of the anteroom, still dark, silent, and empty, after which there is a sound at the corridor door, then silence again. After a moment, we see the handle of the door turn very softly. It is opened with great caution. The Ison of the script, then, is a careful man who is still wary of being caught, while his on-screen realization is almost brazen in how boldly he goes about trying to recover the micro key. Likewise, the televised version sees Ison inserting the right key into the evidence cabinet straight away. On the page, however, he works at the door, trying a number of keys, finally selects the right one. It's also clear that the viewer isn't meant to be aware of the Doctor's presence until he turns on the lights. An oddity in the script comes when Taran prepares to bid farewell to the TARDIS crew. On screen, he quite reasonably tells the Doctor that the authorization from the senior judge gives you permission to take the key back, sir. But the written line would have had Taran saying that it gives me permission to take the key back, which, again, doesn't make sense. A moment later, a stage direction indicates that Taran should produce Ian's travel dial from his pocket, but in the scene as recorded, he already has it in his hand. The subsequent thank you was written for the Doctor, but the on-screen gratitude is Ian's. For the departure of Ian, Barbara and Susan, and then the Doctor, a black mask is overlaid onto the right-hand portion of the screen. The effect is slightly spoilt, because the actors' shadows can still be seen moving across the pillar in the middle of the shot. To establish the story's return to its original setting, John Gorrie reuses the model shot of Arbiton's Island, which had previously appeared in The Sea of Death. To play Yartek, Stephen Dartnell wears the Vord helmet, which has previously sported a semicircular protuberance, now removed. His underlings wear the helmets adorned with circular and triangular antennae, those worn by Vord 1 and Vord 2 in The Sea of Death. However, Terry Nation makes an interesting distinction between Yartek and the other Vord. He describes Yartek as a figure in the sort of monk's habit that Arbitan wore, while behind Altos stands a rubber-suited Vord. This would seem to suggest that Yartek has not been conceived as wearing the rubber outfit of his followers, and could even be interpreted to mean that Yartek himself is not a Vord. The latter point seems to be reinforced later in the scene when Yartek refers to the Vord as my creatures. Altos is in better shape on screen than stage directions would have it. Altos speaks with difficulty, we're told. His face is bruised and there is a little dried blood at the side of his mouth. Presumably this has been deemed unnecessarily graphic for the juvenile audience at which Doctor Who is aimed in 1964. Yartek's gesture to the Vord to fetch Sabitha replaces a less eye-catching nod in the script. What's even more eye-catching, however, is the other Vord's entrance, as his left foot becomes snagged on the hanging being moved aside by the first Vord. But given that the poor Vord actors are literally walking around these cramped sets in flippers, barely able to see through their tiny eye holes, it's remarkable that this is the only time one of them has an on-screen stumble. We at Too Much Information wager that we would have spent half the episode flat on our rubber-entombed faces. And the Vord who trips, by the way, is Peter Stenson. When Yartek threatens Altos's life, the script draws out the tension a little longer than does the recorded version. Before Yartek's instruction to the Vord, a stage direction indicates that there should be silence. Sabitha closes her eyes. Also dropped, or at least not captured on camera, after Sabitha reacts to Altos's imminent demise, is a shot as Yartek holds up a hand to delay the Vord from striking. Following Altos's admission that the Doctor has the micro key in his possession, the last one, a stage direction states that Yartek smiles with pleasure. Is this another indication that Yartek has not been conceived as a rubber-suited figure, or does it simply suggest that Terry Nation imagined that his mouth, if nothing else, would be visible? In the scene where the Doctor is reunited with Susan, Ian and Barbara, the performance follows the scripted action by having Ian startle the Doctor. Oddly, though, the Doctor's written dialogue has him react by explaining, "What on earth are you doing, girl?" as if it were Susan or Barbara who had surprised him. On screen, William Hartnell sensibly replaces girl with dear boy. Ian distracting the Vord to allow the Doctor to club him from behind with his walking stick is an addition not found in the script. There, Vord 2 steps round the corner. Ian grabs him. There is a slight struggle, and Ian knocks him out. At the start of the next scene, Sabitha's comment that
"It's no use"
is meant to refer specifically to Altos struggling to get out of the ropes around his wrists. He then gives up the struggle, although none of this is obvious on screen. More discarded stage directions come when Yartek is masquerading as Arbitan. After Yartek says that Altos looks and sounds well enough, Terry Nation writes, "A hand gestures as if Yartek was in some doubt." Then, when Ian throws the micro key on the floor, he notes that it lands at Yartek's feet. Show Yartek's foot go over it. On screen, however, Ian seems to have tossed it too far away for this to be physically possible. In the brief scene of Ian and Susan that follows, the script has Barbara appear at the other end of the corridor to summon them, and her friends then hurry towards her. The on-screen realisation instead keeps the shot tighter by having Barbara approach Ian and Susan. As recorded, the conscience machine explodes as soon as Yartek inserts the fake micro key. As written, however, he steps back and folds his arms. Suddenly there is a flash and Yartek throws up his arms to cover his face. Likewise, the scene in which the TARDIS crew and their friends escape the pyramid is a little more extensive in the script. After Susan finds the hidden door, dust begins to sweep down the corridor. Bricks begin to fall as they all exit. Hold on corridor as more bricks fall and the dust begins to obscure the picture. The adventure then concludes much as it began 5 weeks earlier, with the film of the TARDIS arriving on the island now run backwards to make the time machine dematerialise. For the second story in a row, there's no cliffhanger leading to the next story. The Aztecs. The Who. Michael Allaby. Michael Allaby, who plays the friendly adjutant Tarn in the final 2 parts of The Keys of Marinus, and earlier in the story played an ice soldier in The Snows of Terror, was born John Michael Allaby on the 18th of September 1933 in Belper, Derbyshire. He got a taste of the stage early on when studying at Ashbourne C of E Junior School, playing the wolf in Little Red Riding Hood at the tender age of 8. He had determined from an early age to be an actor or a writer, or preferably both. "Then I could write stuff and stand on a chair and declaim it," he recalls. At 16, he became a police cadet and patrolled the streets of Birmingham. For national service, he was a jet pilot for the RAF, and it was during this time that he first became interested in the different complexities of the weather. But theatre was his first love. In 1956, he joined Bridlington Repertory, and the following year did a season with the Penguin Players at Tunbridge Wells as juvenile lead and as an actor who had delighted local theatre-goers with near-flawless performances this season, according to the Kent and Sussex Courier. And then he was off to Newcastle. His stage career took him all over the mainland and over to Guernsey, and he spent a year touring in Scotland for a children's theatre. He also spent 15 months understudying in The Mousetrap and worked with Bernard Miles at the Mermaid Theatre. Just before he was cast in Doctor Who, Allaby had a period out of work and filled his time volunteering for an environmentally conscious organisation. Once he'd had his fun on Marinus, he returned there. His acting career went down in a blaze of poignancy. He'd been working at Guildford on a season of plays, but whilst preparing for the 3rd in the run, the theatre burnt down. And he never acted again. This was a source of great sadness for Michael, but as the environmental group was pushing him to work full-time, and this presented writing opportunities too, he moved away from the theatre and into the environment, and was soon writing for The Ecologist magazine. From there, he also began writing books, with his RAF background in meteorology proving to be a very helpful qualification. He became a full-time author in 1973, specialising in popular science, with many of his books aimed at younger readers. His works include Robots Behind the Plough with Floyd Allen, 1974, World Food Resources, Actual and Potential, 1977, 2040, Our World in the Future, 1985, The Woodland Trust Book of British Woodlands, 1986, Thinking Green, an Anthology of Essential Ecological Writing, 1989, The Facts on File series on the Elements, 1992-93, and on the Weather, 1998-2006, How It Works, The World's Weather, 2002, Earth, A Visual Guide, 2007, and Plant Love, 2016. In 1976, he assembled the Dictionary of the Environment with his wife Ailsa, and this led to another strand of the Allaby oeuvre, and in 1984 he compiled the Oxford Dictionary of Natural History for the Oxford University Press, ultimately expanding to edit 5 dictionaries for the publisher. He once spent a year visiting a perfectly ordinary field every few days and describing its life, history and wider context. One of the most joyful experiences of his writing life, the resultant book, A Year in the Life of a Field, came out in 1981. In all, he has written or co-authored just over 100 books and written chapters or sections in many more. He has helped to write reports for the Food and Agriculture Organization and World Meteorological Organization of the United Nations, and for what was then the Countryside Commission, for whom he also edited the first editions of the 15 official guides to the national trails of England and Wales. And each year since 1974, he has written an article on environment for the Encyclopaedia Britannica's Britannica Book of the Year. Now 91, Michael is officially a carer for Ailsa, who has been unwell recently. As for the natural world that he has chronicled so well, I remain optimistic with qualifications, he tells Too Much Information. The world is becoming greener as the small additional CO2 in the air stimulates photosynthesis. So yields and production of the world's major crops is steadily increasing, and the CO2 also makes plants use water more efficiently, so deserts are shrinking everywhere. Polar bear populations are stable or increasing, coral reefs are healthy except where they suffer from pollution or overfishing. In most of the world, human life expectancy is increasing, hunger is decreasing. In Western industrial cities, the air is cleaner than it's been for centuries. Elizabeth I, returning from one of her progressions around England, refused to enter London because the air was so foul, and I remember smogs, smoke and fog, so thick you couldn't see more than a few yards. Rivers in industrial regions are cleaner too. Obviously there's more could be done, but the record is good. The problem comes from the climate cult zealots who would block all economic development and use completely zany technology, mainly windmills, which are very harmful to wildlife, to return us to a pre-industrial standard of living. Fortunately, this affects only the Western world. Russia, India, China, and many other nations watch us in amazement as we unravel. But hey, I'm 91. Too Much Information is very grateful to Michael for keeping us up to date with his fascinating life and work. John Gorrie. John Sumner Gorrie, the director of the Keys of Marinus, was born in Hastings on the 11th of August 1932, the son of Leslie Gorrie and his wife Mary Elizabeth, née Stead, who had come back home to the UK from India, where they lived, in order that baby John be delivered by Mary's father, who was a doctor. Leslie was the chaplain to the Viceroy of India. John and his younger brother Colin were at nursery school in Sussex when World War II broke out, and they were both evacuated to Canada. When he returned in peacetime, the family lived in Bristol, and John was educated there at Clifton College, partaking in a lot of drama. Thanks to the generous encouragement of a teacher, John secured a state scholarship which gained him entry to Oxford. National service was an obligation that resulted in him being offered, after basic training, the chance to train as an officer. He'd been deemed the right sort. He asked if this was compulsory, as he didn't want to be an officer, telling his disbelieving superiors that he feared the officers' mess would be just like the sixth form. but despite his impudence, his qualities were deemed useful in the Education Corps, which is where he spent the rest of his service. Then it was to Oxford, where he studied English, but really decided that acting was what he wanted to do, and so afterwards he studied at LAMDA. Although it was a 2-year course, he asked if he could do just one, as he felt that at 25 he was already getting too old to embark upon a career on the stage. This, they said, was not possible. But then they had to get rid of a student who had done just 1 year. That man's removal meant there was a gap, a year-only gap, that could be filled. So John took the place of the wayward male fledgling actor who had been expelled. That student, by the way, was called Richard Harris. Whatever became of him? Upon graduation in 1957, John became an actor and had quite a successful career for 5 years. He began in rep at Worthing and did a couple of tellies, Sunday night play Statue of David and TV play Tom Bernardo, both in 1958. He hit the West End in The Buskers at the Arts Theatre in 1959 and then fulfilled his acting ambition, which was to get to the Bristol Old Vic. He acted there happily, but found that the directors he was working with in theatre really weren't up to the job and decided that he could do better. He wasn't sure how to go about this, though, and found himself back in London in the early 60s teaching, including writing and directing final year students at his alma mater, LAMDA. At this time, he wrote to the BBC announcing his intention to work for them as a director and secured an interview. His timing was fortunate. BBC Two had just begun, and so there was space in the books for new directors. His first telly was an episode of the magazine soap opera Compact in October 1963, just a month before Doctor Who began. 10 episodes over less than 2 months were essentially his TV blooding, and then it wasn't long before he was, reluctantly, on the team for Doctor Who. It's fair to say that this wasn't really his thing. He aimed for more intellectual fare, but he did the job because, as a contract director, he had no choice. But the Keys of Marinus was to be his only stint at the controls of the TARDIS. Now, it's possible he may have directed episode 3 of The Reign of Terror, but that is by no means proven. We'll come to that in a later episode. But John certainly has no memory of doing it. Anyway, it was the beginning of a long and illustrious career where he was in constant work and responsible for a good number of very highly regarded TV productions. His genre work includes 3 episodes of Out of the Unknown, The Dead Past, 1965, Second Childhood and Satisfaction Guaranteed, both 1966, and he successfully juggled popular drama, Angels, Tales of the Unexpected, 11 episodes over 8 years, Within These Walls, and peak practice, with high-end, prestigious drama, Lily, 1978, Shroud for a Nightingale, 1984, First Among Equals, 1986, and 1987's Cause Célèbre with Helen Mirren and David Morrissey. John was also instrumental in the launch of Rumpole of the Bailey on television and the casting of Leo McKern in the title role. This was his idea. Often he combined his directing duties with writing the scripts he was filming, although that was not the case with the 3 Shakespeares he directed for the BBC in 1980, although he was entrusted with 3 key works in this important series: Twelfth Night, The Tempest, and the biggie, Hamlet, this one starring Derek Jacobi, Patrick Stewart, and Lalla Ward. His favourite works, he tells Too Much Information, Morgan's Boy, about a lad from Manchester going to live with his uncle in Wales, which he made for the BBC in 1984 and cast Gareth Thomas and Martin Hesford in the lead roles. Then there's his epic Edward VII from 1975, starring Annette Crosbie, Robert Hardy and Timothy West. He'd been offered the job to alternate with another director and so turned it down, fearing a dissonance in style, and so producer Cecil Clarke relented and let him do the whole thing. Quite an enterprise, and one that took 18 months to make. The result remains a TV classic, and the series won BAFTAs for Best Design, for Crosby, and for Best Drama Serial. John only stopped directing for television in the year 2000 when the producers he used to work for, as he puts it, retired or died. But he has remained active. For over a decade he taught at BARDA, the British American Drama Academy, not only tutoring but writing and directing the final year film, and he would teach a monthly course in Oxford over the summer. And for decades, hopeful drama students have come to John for coaching to help to get them into drama school. Tom Hardy was one such fledgling, his brilliance obvious to John from the get-go. "I love teaching. I've always loved teaching almost more than directing," says John, who has always maintained a healthy and interested attitude towards changing times and new talent. He remains, however, resolutely offline and has never sent an email in his life, but is a happy correspondent by telephone and is still passionate about his craft, despite now being officially retired. And he never misses an episode of Coronation Street or EastEnders, both of which, he's happy to say, he has also directed. John was of great help with the assembling of this biography for this edition of Too Much Information, and aren't we just so grateful? And so ends another episode of Doctor Who. Back when we started our quest across the planet Marinus, we observed that the Sea of Death took Doctor Who far from its founding Rethian principles into the realm of matinee adventure serial melodrama. That notion has permeated all 6 episodes of The Keys of Marinus, but none more so than this concluding instalment. The opening half, which wraps up the mystery in Millennius, would not be out of place in an episode of Scooby-Doo. Doctor Who may have waited another 13 years to introduce its own talking dog, but just about every other ingredient is here. Our heroes practically have the clues they need to solve the conundrum thrust in their faces, thanks to Carla being just as skilled at implicating herself as her husband was last episode. There must be something in the water in Millennius, or maybe, if we're being generous, with crime having been virtually eradicated for centuries thanks to the conscience, the people of Marinus have just got really, really bad at it. Regardless, the episode also gives us a protagonist being rescued from a concealed place of imprisonment, a trap set at night to catch the leader of the villains, Mystery Inc.'s Fred Jones would be proud, and of course, a climactic unmasking. No doubt Ison was on the verge of blurting out, "And I would have got away with it too, if it weren't for you meddling time travellers." And we're not done yet, because then the action shifts back to Arbitan's pyramid, and that's where things really ramp up. There's a delightful breathlessness to the second half of the episode, which helps the viewer see past such absurdities as Yartek's ridiculous attempt to disguise himself as Arbitan. Is that a rubber triangle on your head, or are you just pleased to see me? You've got to hand it to him. He's really put a lot of effort into the story he tells Ian and Susan, between the invented power leak, which he claims has inflicted him with a deadly disease, and his pretense about soliciting their opinion of Altos. You can imagine him workshopping scenarios with his 2 Voords underlings, who probably keep trying to point out that Arbitan's robes do nothing to conceal his enormous helmet, before giving up and agreeing that, yes, Yartek's old improv group definitely were fools to kick him off the team, and once he gets the conscience working, they'll definitely have to invite him back. But even this nonsense is carried off with such whimsical charm that, much as we might poke fun, we can't say we didn't enjoy ourselves. And then everything wraps up with a clever bit of legerdemain on Ian's part and, of course, a gigantic explosion. It doesn't hurt that The Keys of Marinus ends with a lovely little exchange between Ian and Barbara, reminding us that even when they're stuck in a narrative that's got a little silly, William Russell and Jacqueline Hill never lose sight of the fact that they're still playing normal, everyday people from London, 1963. But one can't shake the feeling that we've just spent 6 episodes looking for a load of keys to a box that then gets smashed to pieces because, as the Doctor helpfully points out, after all that travel dial-related rigmarole, that perhaps doing as you're told by machines is probably not what the show is about. Only those without a conscience, it seems, understand the true message of Doctor Who. Well, hopefully next time Doctor Who goes on a quest to get bits of a big key, it won't end disappointingly. Oh, and machines can make laws, but they cannot preserve justice. Only human beings can do that. Doctor Who, The Keys of Marinus, featured Alan James as Guard, Fiona Walker as Carla, Michael Allaby as Larn, Stephen Dartnell as Yartek, and Martin Court and Peter Stenson as Voords. The title music was by Ron Grainer with the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. The incidental music was by Norman Kay. The story editor was David Whittaker. The designer Raymond P. Cusick, and the associate producer was Mervyn Pinfield. Coming next, Jacqueline Hill enjoys some much-deserved time in the Doctor Who spotlight, and the programme explores for the very first time the implications of the Doctor and his companions setting foot in established Earth history. That's next time on Doctor Who, Too Much Information. Next episode, The Temple of Evil, or I say Yetaxa, you say Barbara, let's call human sacrifice off. Too Much Information, The Keys of Marinus, was presented by me, Toby Haydoke, from a script I co-wrote with Shannon Patrick Sullivan. Additional voice work came courtesy of Chrissy Bone. With thanks to Richard Bignell, David Brunt, and special thanks to Michael Allaby and John Gorring. The series consultant is Richard Bignell, and the music has been specially composed by Wayne Shepherd. There is a supplemental podcast, one per story as opposed to per episode, Far Too Much Information, which is for now exclusive to patrons only, and they qualify for bonus material, early releases, and other exclusives as well as pictures of my dog. Patrons are also many months ahead with Happy Times and Places, another of my podcasts, so if you want to hear a bucket load of special guests talking about Rose for the 100th edition, recorded on the 10th anniversary of New Who, then head to patreon.com/Toby Haydoke. References. Too Much Information would, of course, contain far too little information were it not for the wealth of original scripts and production paperwork that have been unearthed and collected over the years. My debt to those responsible for this Herculean effort is beyond description. The production subtitles on BBC Video's DVD of The Keys of Marinus, written by Richard Molesworth, are a treasure trove of insight and information. Newly available from Telos Publishing is The Doctor Who Production Diary Volume 1, The Hartnell Years by David Brunt, the deepest dive ever undertaken into the surviving documentation that depicts the making of Doctor Who. This goldmine of day-to-day details will let you feel as though you're sitting in the office in 1964, peering over the shoulders of Verity Lambert and David Whittaker. The Doctor Who Production Diary is the latest addition to a small library of splendid reference works that chronicle the earliest days of Doctor Who. They span Jeremy Bentham's pioneering Doctor Who The Early Years, to the titanic tag team of Doctor Who The 60s and Doctor Who The Handbook, The First Doctor, by David J. Howe, Mark Stammers and Stephen James Walker, to the indispensable Doctor Who The Complete History Volume 2, edited by John Ainsworth. The Complete History, also edited by Mark Wright, boasts contributions from Jonathan Morris, Richard Atkinson and Alistair McGowan, and of course it builds upon the archives published in Doctor Who magazine and written by Andrew Pixley. The archive for The Keys of Marinus can be found in issue 310, with updates in the 7th instalment of the Doctor Who magazine special edition. Also a vital resource in the pages of Doctor Who magazine is the Fact of Fiction, for which Jonathan Morris studied The Keys of Marinus in issue 445. Amongst its many charms is a number of additional word-vored puns, but we couldn't let Jonathan have all the fun. And a discussion of relevant periodicals cannot end without an acknowledgement of that premier magazine of Doctor Who research, Richard Bignell's Nothing at the End of the Lane. Occupying its corner of the World Wide Web for 28 years and counting is Doctor Who, A Brief History of Time, open brackets, travel, close brackets. There, Shannon Patrick Sullivan provides another account of the making of The Keys of Marinus, although this one is rather more, well, brief, as it says on the tin. I walk in the shadows of giants. Giants who, like Yartek, prefer to spend an unseemly amount of time in places dubbed things like the archive room. I would like to thank the patrons who support me at patreon.com/Toby Haydock and therefore make these podcasts possible. They include Stephen Moffat, Ruben Herfindahl, Peter Burns, James Curray-Smith, Peter Harness, Ronald Hayden, Rob Leonard, Christopher Meredith, Gavin McLean, Richard Straw, Neil Tate, Nick Tedston, Joel Aarons, Joanne Abbott, Keith Adams, Mark Aldridge, Kit Allen, Neil Allen, Sebastian April, Tilt Areza, Radit Aritza, Endaf Arwin, Simon Ash, Richard Alt, John Babb, P. Baker, Richard Baker, John Ball, Stephen Bamford, Simon Barker, Ollie Barrett, Andy Benison, Richard Bignell, Peter Blackett, Robin Bland, Gareth Bowley, Julian Botting, David Brody, Hugh Buchtman, Tim Burrows, Rebecca Burgess, DC, James Cameron, Paul Cannington, Anthony Carroll, Damien Cartin, Phil Chapman, Ralph Chilton, Susan Christian, Steve Churchill, Kevin Clark, Graham Cluley, Mark Cockram, Charles Coffin, Simon Coling, Ben Cook, Martin Cook, Matt Corner, Leslie Coots, Ben Cowdell, Philip Craggs, Oliver Crocker, Sarah Crotzer, David Crew, Steve Cunniff, Dave Curran, Simon Curtis, Paul Philip Dahlgren and Shanti Day. As mentioned, you can join their number by going to patreon.com/Toby Haydock. As well as advanced releases, there are bonus materials including behind-the-scenes looks at the many Blu-ray and DVD extras that I make, as well as some exclusive interview material and lots of other goodies too, including stuff from my comedy club. That is called Excess Malarkey and is in Manchester every Tuesday night. You can find that on Blue Sky, actually. It's not on Twitter anymore. It's on Blue Sky at Excess Malarkey. And I'm there too at Toby Haydock. I'm also still on X because I'm a flippity gibbet, and I also have social media pages on Instagram and Facebook. You can also support me on ko-fi.com/Toby Haydock if you don't want to get lumbered with a monthly commitment. And I have a website, tobyhaydock.com, and if you would like to really help out without having to do anything financial at all, if you could give these a like, a subscribe, a 5-star rating and a few lines of review anywhere that you find them, then please do. And I also now have a YouTube channel where these go as audio releases only, so a thumbs up and a few comments there and maybe a bit of a watch also help that to get established. Thank you so much.